It's almost harvest in the northern hemisphere, and today we're going to talk about some tips to make a better red wine. If you like winemaking videos like this, make sure to click the little subscribe button below, click the bell to be notified for future videos, and be sure to swing by my website, smartwinemaking.com, where I'll post an accompanying article with a whole lot more detail on this subject, because there is just so much to talk about when it comes to making a high quality red wine. I'll start by saying that there really is no such one perfect, one size fits all red wine. Tastes are very subjective, and that's why it's awesome when you can start making your own wines, because you can tailor that wine to your exact taste preferences. Whereas a professional winemaker or winery might have to kind of make just kind of a middle of the road wine that doesn't offend anybody, but might make the judges happy. If you make a wine that has anything that is kind of, different, whether it be good or bad in your opinion, some judges might rate that as amazing, I love it, but there's always going to be that judge that finds that different thing and rates it poorly. So if you love something about a wine, you can make that, and who cares what those judges think. But we'll talk about some ways to kind of, I'll say, improve the wine. And when I say improve, what I would consider to be a good high quality red wine would be a wine like those wines that are selling for $30 to $50 versus a wine that might sell for $10. And with those wines, you usually get a little bit more body. You get a little bit more tannin. They're kind of maybe not a great wine for a beginner, but man, do they really, let's call it, you get a lot when you get those wines. So the first thing you're going to need to do if you really want to step into that caliber of winemaking is make wine from grapes. A lot of people start out, most people, I would say, start out making wine, whether it be from kits or juice buckets, and this is a great way to learn how to make wine. But the reality is to extract, a red grape into a purple juice requires a process called flash extraction, and you can get a lot of color, but you're leaving behind so much when you're creating these purple juices that you just can't compete with these wines that are fermented on the skins and the seeds for upwards of 2 weeks. It's just so hard to ever match that level of complexity that you're going to get by actually fermenting real whole grapes on the skins. When you do step into making wine from grapes, not all grapes are the same. So there are high quality grapes, and there are certainly much lower quality grapes. And to make a high quality grape as a wine grower is a tremendous amount of work. They've got to pull leaves to expose those berries to sunshine. They might actually pull clusters because, one cane growing upwards on a vine can sometimes produce 2 or 3 clusters. Well, a good grower might decide to pull 1 or 2 of those clusters to dedicate all that energy into that one, and they're sacrificing a lot of tonnage to make decisions like that, but also focusing that energy into those grapes, and you're getting totally fully ripe, flavorful grapes, but at a cost. What you'll also find is good grapes are often grown in the higher elevations, where if you've got a hill, a lot of the fertile soil kind of falls to the bottom, and you end up with this kind of rocky, shallower soil on the top, which grapevines I wouldn't say they like it, but I would say good grapes like a little bit of stress in a grapevine where it's kind of struggling to get by, and it makes these sort of small berries instead of these huge water-filled berries. So the small berries are a lot more concentrated, I would describe them as. Now, let's say you do find that right vineyard and that right grower. The next thing is just making sure that those grapes are picked at the right time. A lot of people will send me messages saying, hey, I got 100 pounds of grapes, what do I do now? Well, this might be like August 1st that they say this, and they're in, somewhere relatively north. Those grapes are just so underripe that you're really going to struggle to make a high quality wine when you don't pick the grapes at the right time. So what you're looking for is optimal sugar development, flavor development. The grapes are going to be relatively acidic until closer to harvest, when the acids kind of start to come down to where you want them, but you don't want to necessarily overshoot that too far. So you're kind of looking for these balanced grapes, and sometimes you are going to have to make a sacrifice on one of these things. And I think, depending on the vineyard, it's going to depend on which thing you're going to sacrifice. So if you've made grapes from the same vineyard over and over, you might start to learn when should you pick and what should you choose to adjust versus letting develop on its own in the grapes. So now that we got over the whole selecting grapes thing, let's get on to the real meat of the winemaking stuff that you can do to control it. And by making wine from grapes, you do have so much control versus your kits and juice buckets. There's only so much you can really do to improve that wine. The first thing I'll say is, when you crush and destem your grapes, you can do something called a saigne. This is a French term. It means to bleed. It's an old technique that's been used for years and years. And basically what you're doing is pulling a little bit of juice off of that must right after you crush and destem. And it does a couple things. One, it gives you a better skin to juice ratio. So even if your grapes aren't the tiniest blueberry sized grapes, you can get a little bit of a fuller bodied wine by pulling some of that juice off. And you can make a nice rosé. So I'll usually pull, I would say basically always saigne. If I have ultra high quality grapes, I might pull like 10% juice off. Where if I have maybe grapes that are a little suboptimal, I can pull a lot of juice off. I might pull 25 or 30% off. And you also get to drink that rosé pretty soon. You can drink it in 6 or 8 months, which kind of helps improve your patience and let that red wine go as long as it really needs to get to the point where it's ready to drink. The next technique that I like to do is called a cold soak. So once you've crushed and destemmed those grapes, you've got a pile of, it's called must. You could go ahead and start the fermentation right then and there. But skin contact time is pretty important, and I personally think skin contact time on the front end of fermentation is even better because you're extracting water-soluble things, which are going to be your fruitier flavors. So to do this, you do a cold soak. So take that barrel or bucket of must and chill it. If it's a bucket, you can put it in an extra refrigerator. You can put frozen 1-gallon jugs or 2-liter bottles of water in it, and just try to keep that temperature as cold as you can reasonably get it. You don't want to freeze it because you're not going to really extract anything at that point. Or, well, I guess you probably will from the breakdown of the berries, but you just want to keep it 40 degrees to, almost 50 degrees would be okay. And 2 to 3 days is a good cold soak. I've heard of people doing it up to 5 days, but I generally will do a 3-day cold soak just to get a little bit more skin time for those grapes. Towards the end of the cold soak, you can actually take some better readings on those grapes too, because you're starting to extract some of what that grape skin and seeds has to contribute to that wine. So I like to take some more measurements. So I'll measure the pH. You can measure the titratable acidity, and I'll always measure the sugar content. So you'll do that with your hydrometer in degrees Brix. And this is a good time to make some adjustments. So you may find that the wine needs a little bit of acid. It could need a little bit of sugar. It could have too high of acid. You might want to make an adjustment the other direction. So the way you're going to make these adjustments are, if you need a little acid, you're always going to use tartaric acid. You're never going to use acid blend because it's got tartaric, malic, and citric. Citric is kind of a problem. Citric can create a little bit more acetaldehyde when metabolized by things like malolactic bacteria, so we don't want that. If you've got a little bit too much acid, you can adjust the other direction. You can use calcium carbonate, you can use potassium bicarbonate. And I really hesitate to try to decrease the acid until I'm 100% positive, because during fermentation the pH can climb a good bit, and depending on how much potassium's naturally in those grapes, it's kind of unclear usually how much it's going to climb. So you don't want to do something like, adjust the pH up only to find it runs away on you even further up. So I'll usually wait to make that adjustment until further along into the fermentation, when I really know where those grapes stand. If you need to add sugar, you can do this just in the form of table sugar. It's really common in France to use beet sugar. I don't think California is allowed to add sugar at a winery, but as a home winemaker, you can do stuff like this, and it gives you a little bit of an edge in some ways. I've got a handy conversion cheat sheet. You can find this on my Patreon page, which I'll put a link in the video description if you want to check that out and help support the home winemaking channel. I'll also mention, before we move on to the next topic, because the wine is going to climb in pH, the acid's basically going to reduce as fermentation goes along. When you pick those grapes, you actually ideally want to see numbers a little bit, pH numbers a little bit lower than where you want that wine to end. So a lot of red wines, you want them to end in the 3.6 range, give or take. Well, if your grapes start at 3.6, they're most likely going to end substantially higher. So maybe 3.8, 3.9, and that's a problem. So when you're making adjustments, you're not trying to hit that number that you want to end at. You're trying to hit a number slightly lower than where you want to end at. And I'll also mention, I rarely will make adjustments based on TA. TA will certainly affect the perception of acid in the wine, but it's not going to affect the stability of the wine. So as long as you have a lot of blending partners to blend that wine with, and you can blend it to taste how you would want it to taste, the number, the TA number is, I would almost call it meaningless. It's more of a projection of how tart that wine will taste. So now you've got your must adjusted, it's time to start the fermentation. And you'll hear a lot of people will preach that, oh, natural fermentation's the way to go. Well, I personally prefer to choose the yeast strain that I'm putting into the wine. And these yeast strains, like your Lalvin yeast strains or White Labs, these companies that make yeast, these are isolated strains. So these are from places like Bordeaux, where they've historically make wonderful wine. Well, they've said what yeast is natural to this region, and they've kind of isolated it from the environment and now offer it in a packet to you. Whereas for me, the natural native Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania yeast might not be the ideal yeast to ferment that wine. So I like to add my own yeast, but what I look for when I choose a yeast is I want a good, reliable strain. A wine must is a really stressful environment for any microbe, including yeast. It's really, really acidic. It eventually ends up relatively high alcohol. Yeast produces sulfur dioxide on its own, which is relatively toxic. So it's a hard environment for any yeast, let alone a yeast that's kind of a pain in the butt anyways. So some of the yeasts I like to reach for would be like Lalvin D21, BDX is a good yeast. I really like the yeasts from Renaissance. They won't produce hydrogen sulfide, which is tremendously helpful as a winemaker. One good red wine yeast from them is Renaissance Muse. But choosing these right yeasts, it's just going to make your life a lot easier. And unlike a home brewer, a home a beer is often drank so quickly by comparison to when a wine is drank from the time that yeast was in contact with it, that in a beer that yeast is contributing substantially to the flavor of the beer. With a wine, the characteristics of that fermentation are certainly contributing. The yeast itself is such a minuscule contribution by comparison to the other fermentation characteristics that those descriptors that the company that sells you the yeast has, don't get your hopes up that that's what you're going to get. The things that are going to matter are, did you have a good clean fermentation, or did your yeast produce a substantial amount of hydrogen sulfide, later morphing into, the burnt rubber garlic mercaptan? Did your yeast produce a ton of acetic acid, which some people might perceive as fruity if they catch it at the very, very early stages, and that might even be a wine descriptor in that yeast packet that it's fruity. Well, it could also be a high acetic acid producer. So those are things I watch for when I'm choosing a yeast. Some yeast will produce a good amount of glycerin, which can give a tiny, tiny bit of perceived sweetness to that wine, which can also create a kind of more perception of fruit, I would say. So if you find a good, reliable yeast strain that you like to work with, one that maybe doesn't require a lot of nitrogen, stick with it. It's a lot. I think you can kind of get to learn a yeast and learn what it needs, and some of these yeasts, like I said, are just huge pain to work with compared to some of these other ones. So the ones I mentioned, I'm a huge fan of. It's not to say there's not other great yeasts that you could choose or you might find to be really nice, reliable strains. Next on our list is going to be fermentation temperature, and this is huge. The style of wine that you make is going to be largely dependent on the fermentation temperature. So often a nice cool fermentation, say closer to 70 degrees, maybe up to low 70s, even colder to like high 60s, can create a really super fruit forward wine. And some people, that's what they want. It's also going to drink well much younger. So a wine that's fermented cool will often be pretty good, say 8 months out or 10 months out. It's going to extract less, which is kind of counterintuitive because it is fruitier. But what's happening is that you're retaining fruit. The fruity taste is more actually of a smell than a taste usually. And by warming that fermentation up, you're kind of blowing away a lot of that fruit. But by warming that fermentation up, you're extracting a lot more from the skins and the seeds. So you are ending up with a more complex, more full-bodied wine by fermenting a little bit warmer. What I like to do usually is do my cold soak. I'll allow the wine to ferment pretty warm for the first, not for the first day because it's usually ramping up, but for say like day 2 and 3, I'll let that wine get up into the mid to even high 80s Fahrenheit. And then I'll try to cool that wine back down. And this is where things like frozen bottles of water can come in handy to try to bring that temperature back down when you're really starting to extract the less water soluble components, but like alcohol soluble components like seed tannin. So you can play with temperature profiles. You can take the same grapes and do a couple different fermentations with them and see what the difference is. And often it's kind of nice to do things like that, make a fruit forward wine and a full bodied wine, and then you can find that by blending a little bit of the fruity wine in with the full bodied wine, you kind of get this best of both worlds effect. You may even find that you want to ferment, one yeast with this wine and a different yeast with this wine, and you can kind of take advantage of the different positive attributes that those yeasts can contribute to that fermentation, because to blend those two yeasts into the same fermentation the more competitive one is going to win, and it's going to finish that fermentation. If you were to test it, you'd find there was only one yeast that finished that fermentation. Another thing you can do to have a lot of influence on the outcome of the wine is your punch downs. So how often do you punch down, and how aggressively are you punching down? To punch down is basically, you take a punch down tool like this one. This is my little punch buddy that I saw on the website. But you just submerge the cap of skins that floats to the top of those grapes. So it's going to float up. It's going to stay, say, 4 to 6 inches above the surface of that wine. Well, you need to keep pushing it back down. It's kind of like making iced tea, where if you dangle a iced tea bag above the surface of the liquid, it's not really doing anything. You kind of got to keep pushing it down. And for the most part, that's as simple as what you're doing. You can do it, some people do it 1 time a day, some people could do it 5 times a day. I like to do it 3 times a day. I do it when I wake up, when I get home from work, and I'll do it before I go to bed. And that seems to give really quite good extraction, I would say. As the fermentation goes along, you'll find that eventually the cap starts to rise a little bit less, and towards the end it's barely floating above the surface at all, and eventually not at all floating above the surface. It'll just kind of stay flush on the surface. So when we get towards that stage of the fermentation where it's so close to finished, I'll usually reduce my punch downs from 3 a day to 2 a day, even maybe 1 a day. And what I'm really trying to do then is just churn up the lees that are kind of settling to the bottom of the fermenter. So I don't want those to kind of pack densely on the bottom and starve out any of those yeasts that are trapped in those gross lees. So I'll just kind of take the punch down tool and work it to the bottom and just kind of churn it. I'm not trying to smash any seeds or anything, just a nice gentle churn a couple times a day, just like if you're making a white wine or a kit wine or a juice bucket. You're going to try to churn that or swirl that up a couple times a day. It's not going to be that different as you get towards the end of fermentation. You can choose to press the wine whenever you want. I would say if you're trying to replicate an ultra high quality wine, you're generally going to want to press pretty late. I'll usually try to get that wine on the skins for at least 2 weeks if I can. Some people will do as short as 5 days, maybe 3 days if you want a really early drinking wine that you just can't wait those couple years for it to mature to where it needs to be. But yeah, I'll usually wait till the wine's completely dry and push it as far as I can. I don't want to push it too far because I don't want that wine to start to oxidize, but a couple weeks, press it. And now there's even things you can do when you press it to improve that wine. So when you first pour the grapes into a wine press, the first juice that's going to run off is called free run, and you're going to get a lot. I would say probably 75% of the juice, if not even more, is going to be either free run or what I would call light press wine. So normally you're going to want to separate that wine. Some people will say that's the premium wine. It's certainly the easier drinking wine, but it's usually, in my opinion, a little bit lacking in the structure building tannin that you're going to get from the hard press wine. So regardless, separate your free run if you have enough juice to do so. And then what you can do is, every time you do a hard press cycle, swap out your carboy and separate your hard press wine and age those wines separately. And what's nice about that is you can choose how much hard press you want to add back in. You might find that you want to add all the hard press back in with the free run. You might find that you only want to add 20 or 10% hard press in with that free run to dial that wine in right where you want. And you can make this decision late in the game when you start to figure out where that wine's going to be. Next in the process is malolactic fermentation. So this is the process when a bacteria converts malic acid, which is sour, into lactic acid, which is smooth, and as a byproduct creates diacetyl, which is buttery. And the thing you have the most control over here is how much of that buttery component you either make or you retain. So you could add the malolactic bacteria culture before the end of primary fermentation, and a lot of that buttery compound that's made will get metabolized by the yeast. So you can do that if you want a little bit less butter. You can intentionally stress the malolactic fermentation by just fermenting a little bit cooler. And when I say fermenting, I mean the end of primary fermentation when it's sitting in a carboy with malolactic bacteria, so malolactic fermentation. By letting that process go a little bit cooler and slower and longer, it can create a little bit more diacetyl. By letting it go a little bit warmer, say high mid 70, 75 degrees versus cool might be 60 degrees, you can produce a little bit less of that diacetyl component. So you've got a little bit of control there. I'll also mention, I mentioned adding malolactic bacteria. I like to do that because I like to have choice over, I just want a good, reliable malolactic strain too, because I don't want a stalled out malolactic fermentation. A good strain I like to use is CH16 for red wines. It's super reliable, super easy. If you wanted a ton of that butter, maybe you wouldn't choose that strain because maybe it's too reliable. You might want a strain that's a little bit sluggish and slow, but I haven't had a wine where I think, man, I wish this had more of the buttery component. So yeah, choose a good strain. The grapes are most likely going to already have some malolactic bacteria on them. It might not kick off on its own, or it might, I'd say normally it eventually will. It just might happen in the bottle if you're not careful. So you want to make sure that this happens on your control, like I said, and not later on its own will. Next is going to be sulfur dioxide management. A lot of people will say, oh, I get headaches because this wine has sulfites. Well, there's a lot of reasons you can get headaches from wine, and it's probably not the sulfites. The yeast is producing sulfites on its own. A lot of the bacteria is producing sulfur dioxide. It's super, super natural. Your body can even produce a minuscule amount of sulfur dioxide. It's also the number one, I would say, means of protecting that wine from creating things that actually are kind of bad, like ethyl acetate and acetaldehyde, which personally I would say are much more likely to give you a headache than sulfur dioxide. So the time when you really want to start managing the sulfites, there's going to be a few times. When those grapes come off the vineyard, I'll usually give them a small dose, say 40 to 50 parts per million free SO2, just to kind of hold back any of that wild yeast and wild bacteria. Start with a clean starting point. And then the next time, I'm going to kind of watch it. I'm going to keep it low though through malolactic fermentation because malolactic bacteria is somewhat sensitive to sulfite. And then once that's completed, I'm going to give it a good protective dose to get through aging, which, if you go to, I've got an article on sulfites and sulfite management. It's not that complicated, but it's a lot to talk about in this video. So swing by the website and check out that article. But if you look at the chart that I have there, you might see that it says you need to add 40 parts per million to protect the wine based on this pH. Well, what I'll normally do after aging is I'll normally add substantially more than that because I know a lot of that sulfur dioxide is going to bind readily with a lot of these reactive things in the wine. Any little bit of acetaldehyde will bind. Any dissolved oxygen will bind. So pretty quickly that number you thought you put in is not going to be that number anymore. So I might add, for that dose that I'll put in after malolactic fermentation, I might add as high as double or say 50% higher. And what I'll find when I test the sulfites later on is they're always lower. Like I never test them and think, wow, I'm surprised that the sulfites are this high. They will readily bind with all kinds of things, and you could leave that wine unprotected really easily. If you're going to age that wine in a barrel, without a doubt, you have to measure sulfites. You can't just guess at what you have. So you're going to want to get an SO2 analyzer, or you can run some lab tests, but a super simple SO2 analyzer like the Vinimetrica, I think it's called the SC100, so quick. Like you can run a test in a couple minutes and it'll pay for itself in the wine that you saved. And also, when it comes time to bottling, you can make sure that you have just enough SO2 to protect the wine, but you won't end up ever having so much that you might catch it on the nose as that kind of burnt match smell, because you're now testing and adding just the right amount of SO2, allowing that fruit to express itself without getting covered from some minuscule burnt match smell that could happen if you overdo it with the sulfites. Next is going to be oak. So, I mean, this is going to be a long video because there's so much that goes into making a high quality red wine. But during the aging period is when you're going to add oak to that wine. And almost every red wine, you're going to add oak. A lot of these wineries now are saying, hey, check out our red wine, it's aged in stainless steel. What do you think about this? Well, I think you just saved a ton of money on oak barrels and you made some thin, wimpy wine that kind of sucks compared to what you would have if you would have aged that in an oak barrel. When you choose an oak product, you've got a lot of choice. My go-to is usually going to be oak cubes. I like them. They're thick enough to get that gradient of kind of toasted oak to untoasted oak in the middle, and they come in a huge variety from American, French, and each toast level, Hungarian. You've got a lot of options, which is what you want because you might find that your taste preferences or that wine might want a certain kind of oak, like a French oak that might be a little bit more mild but a little bit more tannin, or an American oak that'll really blast that wine with a lot of vanilla or coconut or perceived sweetness. But some other options, I like these oak spirals if I add any oak during fermentation because I can easily take them out and transfer them to a carboy. And then this is a new thing that I haven't used yet, but I will be trying soon. This is from Next Level Oak, and this basically replaces your bung, and it has some oak sections, and you can separate it. You can put a medium toast section with a medium plus toast section. So that's a really cool product that I'll be trying out soon. But I just love to kind of fine-tune that wine with the oak. I look at it as it's like if you made a nice salad and put all this effort into it, and then you said, you know what, I'm not going to use any salad dressing. It's probably going to be not as good, realistically. Next thing, this isn't going to really massively change the quality of the wine, but it will change the perception of the wine. It's just making sure that that wine is cold stable. So you're going to want to cold stabilize the wine. What that'll do is assure that you're not going to have any potassium bitartrate or cream of tartar crystals falling out in the bottle and having that last glass of wine have this weird sandy crystal stuff that falls out. All you have to do to cold stabilize is chill the wine. You can let it do it naturally. If you've got cool winters, you can put it out in the garage for a little while. If you've got an extra fridge or a jacketed tank, you can chill that wine quickly to say 27 degrees Fahrenheit and cold stabilize in a matter of 5 or 6 days. If you adjust the pH with potassium bitartrate, you're really going to want to cold stabilize that wine because it's going to be much more likely to drop out a good bit of crystals in the bottle if you bottle it's been aging at 65 degrees and then you bottle it and your house basement or something gets to 55 degrees in the winter. That's when you're going to see those crystals lose, come out of solution and fall out of the, or not even come out of solution, just form and fall to the bottom of that bottle. The next trick, and this is like the ultimate of ultimate tricks, is to blend. So in the United States, a winery can call a wine a varietal wine. They can call it a Cabernet Sauvignon with only having 75% of that bottle be Cabernet Sauvignon. And the reality is, of that 75%, even that's blended with other Cabernet Sauvignons from other blocks of that vineyard or other vineyards in that area. The remaining 25% is often things like Merlot. They could use that to kind of round out the wine. They could add something like Petit Verdot to pump up the color of that wine or the intensity of that wine. But blending is a little, I don't know if I'd call it little known, but it's certainly a thing that wineries are 100%, like, if they're not blending, they're crazy, I'll say. So if you make a handful of wines, hopefully you'll have a handful of carboys in your little wine cellar, and always play with some blends before committing to a bottle. And one little trick I'll do is I'll find a bottle of wine that I know I really like that's very similar to the wine that I'm trying to make, and I'll use that as a benchmark, because sometimes when you're doing your blending trials, your taste buds can get a little bit fatigued, and you might find that what you think is the best thing when you finish your blend, well, come a month later when you open a bottle of it, you might think, maybe this isn't the best thing I could have done for this wine. But if you can get it close to that benchmark, usually you're going to be pretty happy with it. I think there's just so much. I think I've mentioned most of the things. If I missed something, make sure to mention it in the comments. I probably could have talked a little bit more about things like feeding the yeast. Make sure to give adequate yeast nutrient without adding so much that you're going to be left with residual yeast nutrient that other microbes can feed on after fermentation. If you want to learn more, I offer one-on-one consulting. You can learn more about that on my website. And yeah, I hope this helped you with your winemaking. I hope you are getting super ambitious and buying way more grapes than you think you can handle this year and just making a ton of wine. Thanks for watching.